Bradley Hargrove stood in the gravel lot, looked at the faded sign above the converted barn, the covered cars, the soft porch boards, and the man in work clothes standing in front of him, and decided in less than a minute that he understood the whole place. Then he said, "Must be nice to have a hobby." Joe Delaney did not argue. He did not tell Bradley about the 14-month waiting list, or the collectors who passed his name through a private network, or the cars he had returned to life when other people had given up on them. He did not explain the difference between a hobby and a life's work. He had spent too many years learning that explanations offered to the wrong person usually became another thing that person felt entitled not to understand. 16 months later, a man whose wealth had made him indifferent to displays of wealth would walk through that same garage door, stop in front of a red 1954 Ferrari, and look at Joe with a kind of gratitude Bradley had never learned to recognize. Bradley would be there to see it. Joe would not need to say a word. But first there was the garage. The sign above the door had been there so long that the paint had gone from red to the color of old brick, and the letters, Delaney Auto Restoration, had faded to the point where you had to already know what they said to read them from the road. The gravel lot held 2 cars, both under canvas covers, both waiting with the particular patience of machines that have been promised careful hands. The garage itself was a converted barn, high-ceilinged and drafty in winter, hot enough in summer to make the air shimmer above the concrete floor, with walls lined by tools organized in a system that looked chaotic to anyone who didn't understand it, and was, to anyone who did, a kind of precise and personal language. Joe Delaney had been working in that garage since he was 19 years old. He was 44 now. 25 years of the same gravel under his boots, the same smell of oil and metal and the faint sweetness of old lacquer, the same quality of morning light coming through the high windows at 6:30 when he opened up. He had bought the property outright at 27 with money he had saved with a discipline that his friends found excessive and that he found simply sensible, and he had built the business slowly, the way everything worth building gets built, without shortcuts and without the kind of haste that makes people feel like something matters more than it does. What Joe did was restoration, not standard repair, not bodywork, not the quick turnaround jobs that kept a busy shop profitable. He restored classic automobiles, the kind of work that required patience measured in months, sometimes in years, and a specific combination of mechanical expertise, historical knowledge, and the sort of perfectionism that other people called an affliction and that Joe called a standard. He had worked on cars that were museum pieces. He had returned vehicles to conditions their original owners had never seen, because the original owners had bought them new, and new things, by definition, have never been fully expressed. He had begun doing this work almost by accident. At 19, he had been hired as a general mechanic at a shop outside town that did standard repair work, and would have remained a general mechanic indefinitely, except that his employer, a taciturn man named Gerald who had worked on European cars in the 1960s before moving to America, had one day pointed at a 1952 Jaguar XK120 sitting in the back corner of the shop and said it belonged to a client who couldn't pay for the work it needed, and that Joe could have it if he got it running. Joe had spent 8 months on that car in whatever time he could find around his regular work. He had read everything he could find about the model, had sourced parts from 3 countries, had made 4 phone calls to a specialist in England who, to his permanent surprise, had been willing to talk to a 19-year-old American mechanic who had found his number in an old magazine. When the car ran, it ran the way it had been designed to run in 1952, which was the way Gerald looked at it when Joe drove it out of the back corner that first time and then looked at Joe and said, "You've found your thing." He had sold the Jaguar for enough money to buy his tools. He had sold the next car for enough money to make a down payment on the property. He had sold the one after that for enough money to live on while he built the rest. By the time he was 27 and bought the property outright, he had restored 11 cars and had a reputation, in the specific and not particularly large world of serious European classic automobile restoration, as someone whose work was worth waiting for. His waiting list at the time this story starts was 14 months long. This was not a fact he advertised. He had no website. He had no social media presence. He had a single business card, black text on cream stock, with his name, the garage name, and a phone number. And these cards existed because clients sometimes needed to give his number to someone else, and a piece of paper was easier than explaining how to find a place that had no online presence. The business ran entirely on referral, and the referral network was small and specific and operated in a world that Joe Delaney had no particular interest in inhabiting beyond the portion of it that cared about the same things he cared about. He had a daughter named Lily who was 11, and who spent every other weekend at the garage with him, not because custody required it, but because she asked to. She had learned, young, that her father was more himself in that building than anywhere else. And she had grown, in the way children grow toward what is true about the people they love, to find the smell of oil and the sound of tools on metal as comfortable as any other home. The house attached to the property, a farmhouse with a porch that needed repainting and a kitchen that had been modernized in 1987 and not since, was where Joe lived. It was not an impressive house. The porch boards were soft in two places. The kitchen faucet had a slow drip he kept meaning to address. The yard between the house and the garage was functional rather than decorative, with a truck parked where a lawn might otherwise have been, and a garden his mother had planted along the south fence 20 years ago that had survived on neglect and stubbornness. He was not indifferent to the condition of the house, but he was honest with himself about his priorities, and the priority was the garage. The house would be attended to. It always was, eventually. The porch boards would be replaced when he got to them. The faucet would be fixed. These were not failures of care. They were the entirely rational decisions of a man who had a finite amount of attention and who had decided, long ago, where the most important portion of it belonged. His days had settled into a rhythm so gradually that Joe could not have said when it became a life instead of merely a routine. He was awake by 5:30, drank coffee at the kitchen window, and crossed the yard to the garage by 6:15. He worked until the light gave out, cleaned each tool before returning it to its place, made dinner, read for a while, and slept. There were variations, but not many. From the road, the house and garage looked like the sort of rural buildings people passed without considering. The porch needed paint. The kitchen still had the faucet with the slow drip. The yard was functional rather than decorative, and the garden along the south fence survived mostly on stubbornness. Joe did not confuse these things with neglect. They were simply the visible evidence of a man with a finite amount of attention who had decided where the most important part of it belonged. He preferred that people drove past without considering the place. The people who needed to find him usually did. Sandra Delaney, she had gone back to her maiden name after the divorce, Hargrove, and used it with the deliberateness of someone making a point, had been married to Joe for 8 years and had left 4 years ago. She had not left because he was unkind or unfaithful. She had left because she wanted a life that felt as though it was moving toward a larger horizon, while Joe had already found the place where he wanted to stand. He had tried to want the dinners, the travel, the social world she imagined. She had tried to believe the garage was the foundation for something that would eventually expand beyond it. Neither had been dishonest. They had simply mistaken affection for compatibility. Sandra was not shallow, and Joe had never found it useful to think of her that way. She wanted company, movement, rooms full of conversation, the reassurance that her life was connected to something beyond the boundaries of a gravel lot and a rural road. Joe understood the desire even when he did not share it. What he could not give her was the pleasure of wanting it himself. With Bradley, Sandra had found the motion she wanted. City events, connections, a life measured outwardly by momentum. What she had not understood was that Joe's garage was not evidence of a life that had failed to begin. It was the life itself, built slowly and without display. She would not fully understand that until October, when she saw what arrived through its doors. By then, Joe would not need her to. They shared custody of Lily. The arrangement was functional. They communicated through a calendar app and, when necessary, by text. And the texts were polite in the manner of two people who have decided that politeness is the most useful posture for the situation. Joe did not hate Sandra. He did not carry bitterness about the marriage, or not much, or not in the way that makes a person behave badly. He had taken what he had learned from 8 years of trying to want things he didn't want, and had returned, with a clarity that surprised him by how clean it felt, to the life he had always actually been living. She had met Bradley Hargrove. She used his last name now, though they were not married, a detail she seemed to find irrelevant. 8 months after the divorce. Bradley was 49, a commercial real estate developer who operated out of the city, drove a car that Joe would have recognized as expensive from 100 yards away, and had the particular confidence of a man who had been financially successful long enough that he had begun to confuse the confidence with something deeper than money. He was not cruel exactly. He was careless with people in the specific way that comes from never having had to be careful, never having needed anything from anyone who couldn't be bought, hired, or dismissed. Sandra and Bradley had been together for 3 years when she called Joe in October and said she wanted to talk about adjusting the custody arrangement for the holidays. The conversation itself was unremarkable. Joe agreed to the adjustments. He noted them in the calendar app. He went back to the car he was working on, a 1967 fastback that had taken 11 months already and would take at least 3 more, and put the conversation in the part of his mind where he filed things that were done and didn't need to be carried. What he had not anticipated was that Sandra would bring Bradley to the property 2 weeks later. It was a Saturday morning. Lily was with him for the weekend. They had been working together in the companionable way they worked together. Lily on the stool beside his main bench, doing homework with one eardrum on whatever he was explaining about the car, which she processed and retained with a fidelity that continued to surprise him. When the sound of tires on gravel pulled his attention to the window, Sandra's car he recognized. The silver SUV behind it he didn't. He told Lily to stay inside. He went out. Sandra was dressed for something. Lunch somewhere, or a client event, or one of the weekend obligations that had characterized the portion of her life that Joe had never fully understood. Bradley was in a blazer, no tie. The kind of studied casualness that communicates, to anyone paying attention, that the casualness has been selected. He was looking at the garage with an expression that Joe read, immediately and without error, as a man surveying a thing he found unimpressive and finding pleasure in the unimpressiveness. Sandra said she needed to drop off Lily's backpack, which she'd forgotten to send with her Friday. She held it out. Joe took it. Bradley looked at the garage. He looked at the farmhouse with its soft porch boards and its 1987 kitchen. He did the slow sweep of a man who is conducting an appraisal without having been asked to, assembling a picture of a place in order to have an opinion about it. His eyes moved from the faded sign to the covered cars to the barn doors, to Joe himself and back again, and all of it he received with the mild, tolerant curiosity of a man looking at something he considers a category of diminishment. Then he looked at Joe, at his work clothes, at his hands, at the particular ordinariness of a man who has spent 25 years doing the same thing in the same building, and he smiled the way people smile when they are certain they are looking down. He said, "This is the place, then." Joe said, "This is the place." Bradley looked at the covered cars in the lot. He said, "What do you restore, like old Chevys and stuff?" Joe said, "Among other things." Bradley walked a few steps toward the nearest covered car and lifted one corner of the canvas, the way a person handles something they consider theirs to inspect. He looked at the wheel arch beneath it. He let the canvas drop. He looked back at Joe. He said, "What's this one worth?" Joe said, "About 400,000. Bradley looked at it again with the recalibrated expression of a man who has just been given information that moves a thing one category to the left. Not impressed exactly. The 400,000 wasn't his. but less dismissive in a specific and barely visible way. Then the dismissiveness returned, because a car worth $400,000 in a barn like this was not, in Bradley's framework, the same as a car worth $400,000 in the right kind of building. He said, "Must be nice to have a hobby." The word did considerable work in that sentence. It did not mean hobby the way a person means it when they respect the thing they are describing. It meant hobby the way a person means it when they want to communicate that the thing, whatever its surface characteristics, does not constitute real work, real ambition, real life, the kind of life that justifies the space it takes up in the world. Joe looked at Bradley for a moment. Not long. Just enough to complete the picture. Then he said, "Was there something else you needed?" Sandra said she just wanted to see Lily for a moment. Joe called into the garage. Lily came out, assessed the situation with the quiet competence she brought to most situations, hugged her mother briefly, and said hello to Bradley in the neutral tone of a child who has decided politeness is the correct posture, and has not yet decided anything warmer than that. Bradley said hey in the way adults say hey to children when they do not quite know what else to do with them. The interaction lasted 90 seconds. Sandra said goodbye in the efficient way she said most things to Joe. Bradley nodded, in the manner of a man nodding at something he has already categorized and filed. They got back in their cars. The gravel crunched. They left. Joe stood in the lot for a moment, looking at the place where their cars had been. Then he looked at the covered cars, at the garage, at the sign above the door. Then he went back inside. Lily was at the bench, still on her homework, not pretending she hadn't heard. She looked up at him with the watchful, careful attention of an 11-year-old who has learned to read adults accurately and to wait before reacting. Joe said, "You want to hand me the number 7 flathead?" She handed it to him without a word. They worked together in the comfortable quiet that was one of the things Joe valued most in the world, and neither of them spoke about what had happened in the lot until that evening, when Lily said, at dinner, without preamble, "He was rude." Joe said, "He doesn't know any better." Lily said, "That's not really an excuse." Joe said, "No, it's not. It's just a fact." She thought about that. Then she went back to her dinner, and the subject closed, and Joe washed the dishes after, and the evening was unremarkable and good, in the specific way that unremarkable evenings are good when you are living in a place that is actually your life. The following Thursday, the call came. Joe was under the 1967 fastback when his phone rang. He came out from under the car. He looked at the screen. The number was a New York area code, which was not unusual. Several of his existing clients were based in New York, but the number itself he didn't recognize. He answered. The man on the other end of the phone introduced himself as Gordon Fitch. He said he was calling because a mutual acquaintance had given him Joe's number and told him that if he ever needed restoration work done on a specific type of vehicle, Joe Delaney was the only name worth knowing. Joe asked what vehicle. Gordon Fitch was quiet for a moment, in the way a person is quiet when they are about to say something they are accustomed to having received with a specific kind of reaction. Then he said, "I have a 1954 Ferrari 500 Mondial Spider. It was my father's. I've had it in storage for 11 years and it needs to be returned to roadworthy condition without compromising its originality." Joe sat down on the stool by his main bench. There were, in the world, a small number of 1954 Ferrari 500 Mondial Spiders. Fewer than 30. Each one was worth, in the current market, somewhere between $4 and $10 million, depending on provenance, condition, and the specifics of the car's racing history. The model had been one of Ferrari's early competition vehicles, built for endurance racing, and the surviving examples were among the most historically significant automobiles in existence. Restoring one was not a job that most people in Joe's field would be offered in their careers. It was the kind of job that appeared if you were very good and very patient and had spent 25 years building a reputation in a world that didn't advertise itself. Once, he asked Gordon Fitch 4 questions. He asked about the car's last service date. He asked about storage conditions. He asked about the provenance documentation. He asked about the racing history. Gordon answered all four with a precision and completeness that told Joe two things. The man knew his car, and the car was the real thing. Joe said he would need to see it before he could give a timeline or a number. Gordon said of course. He said he could have it transported to Joe's shop the following week if Joe was willing. Joe said he was willing. They arranged it. Gordon gave Joe his contact information. Joe wrote it down in the same spiral notebook where he kept all his client notes, in the same careful handwriting that had recorded every car he had worked on for 25 years. His notebook entries were brief but specific. A line or two for each call, the key points, the decisions outstanding, the questions that needed answers. He had been keeping this notebook since his first client. There were 11 of them on the shelf in the garage office, identical, filled without drama, the unspectacular record of a working life conducted at a consistent level of attention over a long time. He finished the call. He set the phone down on the bench. He sat for a while in the quiet of the garage, which was the kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound. The building made sounds, the town made sounds at a distance. The covered cars outside existed in the particular silence of things that are resting, but the presence of a specific quality of attention, the quality of a man sitting with something significant and giving it the space it warranted before moving on. A 1954 Ferrari 500 Mondial Spider. His father's car. 16 months of work, if he was honest about what it would take. He was always honest about what things would take, which was why the people who hired him came back and sent others, and why the others came. Then he went back under the fastback. The car arrived on a Tuesday morning, on an enclosed transport that was itself worth more than most of the vehicles Joe had ever owned. The driver, a professional transporter who worked exclusively with high-value automobiles, was professional and precise and treated the uncrating process with the solemnity it warranted. Joe watched. He did not rush. When the 1954 Ferrari 500 Mondial Spider came off the transport and sat in the morning light of his garage lot, Joe stood with his hands at his sides and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. The way you look at something when looking at self is the appropriate first response. It was extraordinary, even in its current condition. The red paint gone dusty, the aluminum body showing the particular patina of stored rather than driven. The leather interior cracked and dry. It was extraordinary. It had a quality that very few objects possess, the quality of being exactly what it was meant to be, without compromise and without apology. The product of minds and hands that had cared completely about the thing they were making. Ferrari's engineers in 1954 had not been designing for the road. They had been designing for the circuit, for the specific demands of long-distance racing in the early years of the sport. And that purpose had produced a form that was not decorative, but was beautiful in the way that true precision is always beautiful. Functionally, completely, without a wasted line. Joe walked around it once, slowly, then again faster, seeing things the first pass had noted and flagging them for the second. He crouched by the front wheel arch and looked at the panel fit. He opened the driver's door, carefully, with the practiced gentleness of a man who understands the weight of what he is touching, and looked at the interior. He looked at the dash. He looked at the gauges. He looked at the specific quality of deterioration in the leather and the specific nature of the oxidation on the exterior, and the general condition of the mechanicals visible through the engine cover. And all of it told him things in a language he had spent 25 years learning to read. He said nothing to the driver, who waited at a respectful distance. When he was done, he stood and looked at the car one more time, and then he said, "Tell Mr. Fitch it's in good hands." The driver said he would. The car went into the garage, the doors closed. The work began. Gordon Fitch was 61, the founder and former CEO of a technology company he had built in the 1990s and sold in 2006. He had been wealthy long enough to find displays of wealth tiring. The Ferrari mattered to him for a simpler reason. It had belonged to his father, an engineer and amateur racing driver who had treated cars as things to be understood rather than possessed. After his father died, Gordon stored the Ferrari for 11 years because he did not know how to return it without losing the history inside it. He asked 5 restorers before an elderly Pennsylvania specialist told him there was one person who would understand the difference between making the car valuable and making it right. The other shops had not been incompetent. Gordon was careful about that distinction. They were simply oriented toward the wrong question. They spoke about finish, auction results, and presentation. Joe spoke first about documentation, storage, racing history, and the things a car had carried through time. Gordon heard the difference immediately. Joe and Gordon spoke every 3 weeks during the restoration. Their conversations were technical, careful, and occasionally personal in the quiet way that happens when two people care about the same object for different but compatible reasons. When Joe found a small ring scratch behind the driver's side panel, probably left by Gordon's father removing his wedding ring before driving, he asked what Gordon wanted done. Gordon told him to leave it exactly as it was. Joe said of course. The restoration took 16 months. Joe worked on nothing else during that time, explaining the delay to his other clients with the same honesty he brought to everything. 2 waited. 1 accepted a referral. The Ferrari required parts that no longer existed, materials that had to be traced through old contacts in Italy, Germany, and England, and a series of decisions that were more archaeological than mechanical. Joe fabricated what had to be fabricated, preserved what carried the car's history, and replaced only what reliability required. He made one fuel system component twice, discarding the first even though it measured correctly, because something about it was wrong in a way he could not accept. A contact in Milan sent a period reference document that clarified a small but important detail in the original coachwork. An English supplier located leather close enough to the original that Joe knew, when he held it, it would not announce itself as a modern substitute. None of this looked dramatic from outside the garage. Most of it looked like a man reading, measuring, waiting for packages, and refusing to move on before a question had been answered. Some choices took days. Some took weeks. Gordon was involved whenever the decision belonged partly to memory rather than engineering. By the end, the work had become what it always became for Joe, a long argument with time, conducted patiently until the object in front of him could be itself again. When the car was finished, Joe drove it. When the car was finished, Joe drove it in the gravel lot at 5 in the morning before anyone else was present. He did not own a car worth anything close to what he had just returned to condition. He drove a truck that was 12 years old and that he maintained with the same care he gave everything he worked on, which meant it ran well but did not look like anything. He was not a man who needed things to look like anything. He was a man who needed them to work well, to be what they were, to have been given the attention they deserved. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before he started it. He looked at the steering wheel. He looked at the gauges. He looked at the small panel on the driver's side where a scratch the size of a thumbnail, made by a ring, had been left exactly as found by the man who had discovered it and understood what it was. He started the engine. The Ferrari, in the morning quiet, sounded the way a thing sounds when it has been understood completely and returned to itself. The engine had a note, specific, resonant, entirely its own, that Joe had been working toward for 16 months and that, at 5 in the morning in a gravel lot behind a converted barn with a faded sign above the door, was as close to perfect as he had ever heard anything be. He drove it to the end of the lot and back. He drove it again. He sat with the engine running and listened. He brought the car to a stop. He sat for a moment. Then he went inside and called Gordon Fitch. Gordon arrived 2 days later. It was a Sunday afternoon, which happened to be the afternoon Sandra was scheduled to pick Lily up at 3. Joe had known the pickup was coming in the ordinary way he knew all such things. The calendar app had said so for weeks, and had given it no more thought than he gave any other part of the arrangement. At 2:30, Lily was sitting at the small table in the garage office finishing a school project, while Joe cleaned the last of the fine dust from the Ferrari's rear wheel. The car stood in the center of the floor beneath the high windows, red enough now that the color seemed less painted than released. The doors of the garage were open to the mild October afternoon. At 2:40, Sandra's car came up the gravel drive. The silver SUV followed behind it. Joe heard the tires before he looked up. For one brief second, he wondered whether something had changed in the schedule. Then he saw Sandra step out of her car and Bradley step out of the SUV, and understood only that they had arrived early. Lily came out of the office with her backpack already over one shoulder. Sandra waved when she saw her. Bradley looked past Joe almost immediately, toward the car in the middle of the garage. The Ferrari had that effect on people. Even people who did not know exactly what they were looking at understood that they were looking at something that did not belong to the usual category of things. The car was too low, too intentional, too completely itself. Its red did not make it look expensive in the ordinary sense. It made it look alive. Bradley stopped walking. He looked at the car. Then he looked at Joe. Then he looked at the car again. He said, "Is that the same kind of thing you work on?" Joe wiped his hands on a clean rag. He said, "This is the one I've been working on." Bradley took a step closer, not touching anything this time. The change in him was not dramatic. It was smaller and, because of that, more visible. The man who had lifted the corner of a canvas, cover 16 months earlier, as though the objects beneath it were there for his appraisal, now kept his hands at his sides. Sandra looked at the Ferrari too. Her expression moved through surprise and then into something quieter. She had heard enough, in fragments, to know that Joe had been working on an important car, but she had not seen it. She had not understood the scale of what important meant in this particular world. Before anyone could say more, another car came up the gravel drive. It was a dark gray sedan, clean but not showy, the kind of car that could have belonged to a professor, a doctor, or a man who had stopped needing automobiles to explain who he was. It parked near Joe's truck. A man got out. He was 61, gray-haired, dressed in a navy sweater and simple dark trousers. He looked at the barn, the newly restored red sign, the gravel lot, the covered cars, and the open garage door. He stood for a moment with one hand resting on the roof of his sedan. Then he walked toward the garage. Joe stepped forward. He said, "Mr. Fitch." Gordon looked at him and smiled. He said, "Gordon, please." Then he saw the Ferrari. The smile left his face, not because anything was wrong, but because some things require a person to stop using the expressions they have been carrying through the day. He walked into the garage slowly, past Sandra and Bradley without seeming to register them at first, and stopped 3 feet from the car. For a while, nobody spoke. Gordon looked at the front wheel arch. He looked at the panel fit. He looked at the leather through the open driver's door. He looked at the instruments, the steering wheel, the small panel on the driver's side where the faint arc of a ring scratch had been left exactly as Joe found it. His hand hovered near the mark but did not touch it. He said, "You left it." Joe said, "You told me to." Gordon nodded once. He sat in the driver's seat. His hands rested in his lap. He looked out through the windshield at the gravel lot, the garage doors, the line of trees beyond the road. For a second he looked much younger and much older at the same time. Then he got out. His eyes were bright. He did not make a display of it. Joe did not make a display of pretending not to notice. Gordon said, "How long did you have it running before you called me?" Joe said, "About 8 minutes." Gordon said, "What did it sound like?" Joe said, "Like it was supposed to." Gordon smiled then, a small expression that carried more feeling than a larger one would have. He said, "My father would have liked you." Joe said he appreciated that. Only then did Gordon seem fully aware that other people were standing nearby. Joe made the introductions because it was the ordinary thing to do. He said, "Gordon Fitch, this is Sandra Hargrove, and Bradley." Gordon shook Sandra's hand first, then Bradley's. His manner was polite and unhurried, the manner of a man who had spent enough years around people trying to calculate his value that he no longer participated in the calculation. Bradley looked once more at the Ferrari. He said, "This is a 500 Mondial, isn't it?" Gordon looked at him. He said, "A 1954 500 Mondial Spider. One of fewer than 30. My father bought it in 1961. Bradley nodded slowly. He had the look of a man trying to find the correct place to put information that had arrived too late for the conclusion he had already made. Gordon turned back toward the car. He said, "I asked 5 restorers before I found Joe. The first had a showroom that looked like a museum. The second had a 3-year wait. 2 others could have made this car look perfect for an auction." He paused, his hand resting lightly on the top edge of the driver's door. He said, "Joe was the only one who understood that perfect was not the point." The garage was quiet. From the office, Lily watched her father with the calm, attentive expression she had learned in the years she had spent beside his bench. Bradley said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Gordon and Joe went through the documentation together at the workbench. Every decision, every component, every source. The complete record of what had been found, what had been preserved, what had been remade and why. Gordon asked careful questions. Joe answered them in the same straightforward way he had answered every question about the car for 16 months. Bradley remained near the garage door. At some point, he looked up at the walls lined with tools, at the handwritten notebooks on the shelf in the office, at the high windows, at the ordinary concrete floor. The building had not changed. The gravel lot had not changed. The only thing that had changed was the category he had placed them in, and he could not change it back. When they were finished, Gordon asked what he owed. Joe gave him a number. Gordon looked at it. He said, "Joe, I looked into your work before I called you. I spoke to 3 people who have cars you restored. I understand what this work is worth, and I understand what it is worth specifically in the context of this car. The number you have given me does not reflect either of those things." Joe said, "It reflects what I charge." Gordon said, "I'd like to pay what the work is worth." Joe said, "That is what the work is worth. To me, in my shop, with my tools and my time." Gordon looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked around the garage. The wall of tools, the open doors, the afternoon light on the concrete, Lily standing by the office, the faded place that had never been faded in the ways that mattered. He said, "All right, but I'm going to send you referrals, and I'd like you to let me." Joe said that was fine. Gordon paid the invoice. He arranged the transport for the return of the car to his home in Connecticut, where it would be driven rather than stored, which was what his father would have wanted. Before he left, he stood in the garage doorway for a moment. He said, "How long have you been here?" Joe said, 25 years. Gordon said, "Good place." Joe said, "Yeah." Gordon shook Joe's hand. Then he walked back across the gravel to his unremarkable sedan. The transporter would arrive later that afternoon. For now, the Ferrari stayed where it was, glowing in the center of the garage as the sun moved slowly toward the trees. Sandra waited until Gordon had driven away before she spoke. Lily had gone to the house to get the sweater she had forgotten. Bradley was standing by his SUV with both hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. He had been quiet for almost an hour. Sandra looked at Joe. She said, "I didn't understand." Joe leaned one hand against the bench. He said, "I know." She said, "When we came here before, when Bradley said what he said, I should have said something. And I should have understood a long time ago that this wasn't just—" She stopped. There was no word available to finish the sentence that would not make the problem clearer. Joe thought about the word hobby. He thought about Bradley lifting the canvas cover. He thought about Lily handing him the number 7 flathead screwdriver without a word. He thought about the 16 months of work that had filled every day between that morning and this one. He said, "It's all right, Sandra. She looked at him. She said, "It's not really." He said, "No, but it's all right anyway." Bradley looked over then. His expression was not angry. It was not even embarrassed in the way embarrassment sometimes makes people defensive. It was simply smaller than it had been before. He said, "I was wrong about this place." Joe looked at him. He said, "You didn't know it." Bradley started to say something else, then stopped. He nodded once. That was enough. Lily came back from the house with her sweater. She walked to Joe, slipped her hand into his for a second, then looked at the Ferrari. She said, "Is that the one you were fixing all this time?" Joe said, "Yeah." She looked at Bradley, then at the car, then back at her father. She said, "It looks better." Joe smiled a little. He said, "It always looked pretty good." Sandra called Lily over. Lily hugged Joe, got into her mother's car, and waved through the window as they pulled away. Bradley followed in the silver SUV. The gravel crunched under both vehicles, exactly as it had 16 months earlier. Joe stood in the lot for a moment. Then he went back inside. The Ferrari waited in the center of the garage. The tools were where they belonged. The workbench had a clean rag folded on one corner. The high windows were beginning to turn gold with the late afternoon light. Joe picked up the number 7 flathead screwdriver and returned it to its place. Gordon Fitch sent 3 referrals in the following 6 months. All 3 were serious collectors with vehicles of significant historical value. 2 of them Joe accepted. One was a car he didn't feel equipped to do justice to, and he said so honestly, naming the limitation precisely and without embarrassment, and referred them to a specialist in Germany, whose understanding of that particular manufacturer was, in Joe's assessment, better than his own. The German specialist called him afterward to say thank you. Joe said, of course. That was how the network worked, and why it worked, and why the people in it trusted each other. Because everyone in it was honest about what they knew and what they didn't, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. His waiting list reached 22 months. He repainted the sign above the door. Same letters, same font. Red this time, a good solid red that you could read from the road. He had mixed the paint himself. 3 test batches before he was satisfied with the color, which was not the red of the original sign, but the red he had intended when he first painted it and had not quite achieved. He painted it on a Saturday afternoon, up on a ladder with Lily watching from below, and offering opinions on the letter spacing that were, he had to admit, not wrong. He fixed the faucet in the kitchen. It took 4